So you've been playing Shapez 2 since the early access days, or maybe you've jumped in now that version 1.0 has finally arrived. Either way, welcome to the point where the game stops holding your hand and starts completely wrecking your factory layout. That is exactly why I've put together these 10 advanced tips, things I wish someone had told me much sooner, and that completely changed how I think about building in this game. I'm Mary, and the video is about to begin. The Make Anything machine is basically the pinnacle of the game, and the turning point that will transform your experience is to stop building a new factory for every shape the game asks for. Instead, you will create universal modules, one for cutting, one for coloring, and one for stacking. Each module does only one thing, but it does it perfectly and is reusable for any shape you need to produce. Your MAM structure needs to be organized into 4 layers and 4 quadrants, because that is exactly how the game interprets the most complex shapes in the late game. Each layer represents a level of the final shape, and each quadrant represents a position within that layer. When you organize the machine this way, you can feed shapes with empty parts or crystals without breaking the production logic, something that would be impossible in a generic, disorganized factory. The part that confuses players the most is precisely dealing with empty layers and crystals. When the requested shape has a layer that doesn't exist, or a crystal in the middle, the MAM needs to know to ignore that empty slot or insert the crystal in the right position without compromising the other layers. This is where belt filters and logic gates come in. They read the shape signal and decide what passes, what stops, and what goes to the trash, ensuring only what is necessary moves on to the next stage. And the big secret behind all this? System cleaning. Every time you change the shape the MAM is producing, residue will remain inside the machine. Half-finished shapes, wrong pieces stuck on the conveyors. You need to let the system drain before changing the configuration, or you'll mix shapes and jam the entire production. Experienced players use signalers and trash chutes at strategic points to speed up this cleaning process. Once you master this, changing shapes becomes a matter of seconds, not minutes. If you've reached the point in the game where shapes start requiring 5 layers, congratulations! You've entered a level of complexity that makes many people pause and scratch their heads. And this is exactly where the pin pusher becomes your best friend, because it completely changes the logic of how you think about constructing complex shapes. The mechanic is simple to understand, but devastatingly powerful once you truly embrace what it offers. What the pin pusher does is place a layer of pins underneath your shape. And while that sounds simple, it opens a huge window of possibilities. When you stack a shape that has pins at the base onto another structure, those pins function as spacers, elevating the layers above. The real trick here is that a shape is limited to a maximum of 4 layers. So if you try to create something with 5 layers, the top layer simply disappears. This might seem like a frustrating limitation, but in practice, it's a sculpting tool. You use this limit to your advantage to remove unwanted layers with surgical precision. In practice, this means a shape that would naturally only have 3 visible layers can be treated as if it had 5, because the pins pushed downward create the scaffolding that supports the layers above in the correct position. The technique consists of taking your 3-layer shape, stacking a shape with pins underneath it, and letting the 4-layer limit do the dirty work of cutting off whatever remains at the top. You can even chain several pin pushers in sequence to push layers progressively, like an assembly line, where each station raises it 1 level further. The end result is exactly the 5-layer shape you needed, built from the bottom up. Honestly, once I truly understood how the pin pusher works, it changed the way I plan entire factories in Shapez 2. You stop thinking of shapes as fixed structures and start seeing them as clay, something that can be pushed, elevated, and cut. If you don't have a dedicated pin pusher blueprint in your library yet, create one now. A modular design with 3 pin pushers in sequence already solves the vast majority of complex shape situations the game will throw at you. It's one of those mechanics that separates those who are just surviving the game from those who are truly dominating the factory. There comes a point in Shapes 2 where belts just can't keep up anymore. You look at the map, see that platform far away producing exactly the resource you need, and the idea of creating a kilometer-long belt line to it feels exhausting, not to mention the maintenance cost and the visual mess it creates in your factory. This is when trains stop being a pretty decoration on the map and become the backbone of your entire logistical operation. The big leap that version 1.0 brought was precisely making trains smarter and more practical to use in the factory's day-to-day. The quick stop functionality is a perfect example. Instead of the train being forced to stop at every station and wasting time waiting, it only loads material if there is something available at that moment. This means you can create routes with multiple stops without fear of bottlenecks. The train simply ignores empty stations and moves on, maintaining a constant flow of resources throughout the network. But what really takes train logistics to another level is direct transfer between trains. Imagine you have one train collecting complex shapes from a remote platform and another train responsible for carrying fluids from another corner of the map. Now you can have these two trains meet at a central hub and exchange cargo directly without needing to unload everything onto intermediate belts. This drastically reduces the number of structures required and makes your factory much cleaner and more efficient to manage in the long run. When you start thinking of your factory as a distribution network rather than a single production line, everything changes. Trains allow you to divide your operation into independent cells. Each platform produces what it does best, and the trains connect these cells like arteries. It is the transition from a messy factory full of scattered belts to a true industrial system, where every resource has a clear and efficient path to its final destination. One of the most impressive things about Shapes 2 version 1.0 is realizing that the map isn't just a flat surface where you spread belts and machines. The third dimension exists to be used for real. And when you start stacking production platforms vertically, it feels like you've unlocked a completely different game. It's like going from a single-floor factory to a multi-story industrial complex, and the difference in efficiency is absurd. What makes this approach even more powerful is combining it with the blueprint system. Instead of building each platform from scratch every time you need more painting or stacking capacity, you create a module once, save it as a blueprint, and replicate it with a click. It transforms what would be hours of repetitive work into seconds. You literally clone an entire factory and position it on top of the previous one, expanding vertically without any extra effort. The key here is to think modularly from the start. When you design your first production platform, already think of it as a unit that will be duplicated. Aligned inputs and outputs, standardized spacing, belt connections in fixed positions. A poorly planned blueprint becomes a problem you'll carry through your entire game progression, but a well-constructed blueprint becomes one of the most valuable tools in your factory. You'll use it dozens of times without needing to change a thing. When you finally have a tower of modular platforms working in perfect synchrony, producing complex shapes on several floors at once, it gives a satisfaction that's hard to explain to someone who has never played. It's that moment where you stop, look at the creation, and think, I built this. 3D construction transforms Shapes 2 from a belt puzzle into a true engineering experience, and blueprints are what make that experience sustainable and scalable until the end of the game. If there's one thing that can silently destroy your entire production in Shapes 2, it's cascading jams. Your factory's running perfectly, then a line fills up, stops accepting material, the previous belt jams, the one before that jams too, and suddenly half of your operation is at a standstill because of a bottleneck you didn't even notice was forming. The overflow splitter exists exactly to prevent this nightmare from happening. And once you learn to use it, you'll never build a production line without it again. The way it works is elegant in its simplicity. The overflow splitter checks if the main line still has the capacity to receive material. If it does, it sends it through normally. If the line is full, it automatically redirects the excess to an alternative output, whether that's the trash or another production line. This means your machines never stop working for lack of space to place output, and the input flow continues arriving without interruption. It is a small mechanism that carries a huge impact on the stability of more complex factories. The smartest application of the overflow splitter isn't just throwing excess into the trash, it's using that excess as a resource. You can set up a system where the main production has priority, but whenever it is saturated, the extra material is automatically redirected to a secondary line for less complex shapes, or to a storage buffer. This transforms what would be wasted material into extra productivity, and your factory begins to operate with an efficiency that feels almost automatic. There is a mindset shift that happens when you start using the overflow splitter consistently. You stop trying to predict exactly how much material each line will need and start building systems that self-regulate. Instead of manually calibrating every splitter and every belt speed, you design your lines to handle excess naturally. It's the difference between a factory you need to monitor all the time and one you can leave running on its own while you expand other areas of the map. When you start scaling the production of colored shapes and shapes too, paint management becomes a logistical problem in its own right. The natural temptation is to centralize everything near the vortex. After all, that's where the shapes arrive to be finalized, so it makes sense to mix the paints nearby, right? Wrong. This decision seems logical at first, but as your factory grows, you'll realize you're wasting precious belts transporting primary paints from one side of the map to the other just to mix them at a central point. The logic behind mixing paints immediately next to the sources is simple and powerful. You drastically reduce the number of belts needed. Instead of transporting red, blue, and yellow paints separately over long distances to a central mixing hub, you combine those paints at the source and send only the final color for the rest of the journey. A belt of purple paint occupies the same space as a belt of red paint, but it carries much more valuable information for the rest of your production. In addition to saving space, this approach simplifies the reading and maintenance of your factory immensely. When each paint source has its own integrated mini-mixing module, you know exactly where each final color is coming from and what the expected flow is on each belt. Diagnosing a problem with the wrong color or insufficient flow becomes trivial. You go straight to the corresponding source instead of tracing a web of colored belts to the center of the factory, trying to figure out where the mixing went wrong. This tip seems small on paper, but it represents a design philosophy that makes all the difference in the long run. Process the material as close as possible to where it originates. The sooner you transform raw materials into something more refined, the less infrastructure you need to transport those resources across the rest of the map. When you internalize this idea and start applying it not only to paints, but to your entire factory, the result is a much leaner, more readable operation that is much easier to expand without creating new bottlenecks in the process.
When you start working with advanced 3D shapes and shapes too, there comes a point where simple automation of belts and splitters is no longer enough. Mixing breakable crystals with solid parts in the same structure requires surgical precision, because if you unstack one layer too many or too few, the entire shape is wrong, and you only discover the problem much later when the delivery fails. This is exactly where logic layer detection enters the scene, transforming a manual and error-prone process into something the factory solves by itself. The core concept is using logic circuits to detect how many layers a shape has before it goes through the unstacking process. Instead of manually configuring each unstacker for a fixed number of layers, which only works as long as all shapes arrive identically, you create a system that reads the shape's structure in real time and automatically decides how many layers need to be removed. This is especially critical with breakable crystals, which react differently to the unstacking process compared to conventional solid parts. In practice, implementing this well requires you to think of your production line as a decision-making system and not just a transport path. You position logic sensors strategically before the unstackers, define the conditions. If the shape has 4 layers, do this. If it has 3, do that, and let the circuits manage the flow automatically. The result is a line that processes varied shapes without jamming, without producing wrong shapes, and without needing your constant intervention to adjust settings. This mechanic represents the final leap between building a functional factory and building an intelligent one. When you have logic circuits making real-time decisions about how to process each shape passing through the line, you are essentially programming your factory, and that is one of the most satisfying experiences Shapez 2 offers. Mastering logic layer detection isn't just about efficiency, it's about understanding the game at a level that most players never reach, and feeling that the factory you built is an extension of your own reasoning operating within the game world.
The manufacture mode in version 1.0 of Shapez 2 brought a layer of depth that completely changes how you think about progression within the game. And one of the most underrated tools in this mode is the trade station, because many people ignore it at first, thinking it's a situational resource, when in fact, it can be the smartest shortcut you'll use in your entire journey. The idea of converting basic shapes into complex shapes without needing to build an entire production line from scratch is too powerful to be left aside. The reasoning behind this is purely economic and time-based. Building a complete production line for a specific complex shape requires planning, space, resources, and most importantly, assembly time. If you already have basic shapes in abundance, and you almost always do because basic production is the first thing you scale, the trade station transforms that excess stock into exactly what you need to complete the current task. It's trading what you have in excess for what you need now, without waste and without complication. The most strategic application of trade stations is using them as a short-term solution while you build permanent infrastructure. You have an urgent task that requires a specific complex shape, but your factory doesn't produce it autonomously yet. Instead of delaying progression, waiting for the line to be ready, you use the trade station to fulfill the task now and gain the time needed to build the definitive solution without pressure. It's resource management and time management at the same time. And this balance is what separates a good player from an excellent player in manufacture mode. In the end, trade stations teach a valuable lesson that goes beyond Shapez 2. The most efficient solution isn't always the one you build from scratch. Sometimes the smartest path is recognizing what you already have available and finding the most direct way to transform that into what you need. When you start integrating trade stations into your strategy consciously and not just as a last resort, your factory gains a flexibility that makes any challenge in manufacture mode much more manageable. There is a category of tips that many people ignore because they seem secondary settings, but they make a huge difference in the actual experience of playing, and dark mode, combined with the performance improvements of version 1.0, fits perfectly into this category. When you're spending hours inside a giant factory, adjusting lines, tracking bottlenecks, and planning expansions, visual comfort isn't a luxury, it's productivity. Dark mode reduces eye fatigue during long sessions in a way that you only realize how much you needed it once you activate it. But the part that really matters for those already building large-scale factories are the LOD and UV optimizations that 1.0 introduced. LOD, which stands for level of detail, is a technique where the game automatically reduces the visual detail level of structures that are far from your camera, which sounds like a small technical detail, but represents a huge saving in processing power when you have hundreds of platforms scattered across the map. The practical result is that your giant factory continues to run smoothly, even when the density of machines and belts starts to become absurd. UV optimization complements this by improving how the game renders the textures of structures in high density. When you have an area of the map completely covered in machines, belts, trains, and vertically stacked platforms, the rendering cost can stall even reasonably good computers. With the UV improvements in version 1.0, this cost is distributed much more intelligently, allowing you to scale the factory to sizes that previously simply weren't viable without constant performance drops. So before you head out to build your next mega factory, it's worth spending 5 minutes in the game settings to ensure you're taking advantage of everything version 1.0 offers in this regard. Activate dark mode, check the LOD options, and make sure performance optimizations are enabled, because there's nothing more frustrating than having an incredible expansion idea and seeing the game lag right when your factory is at its most glorious moment. Version 1.0 was clearly designed for players who want to go far, and these tools exist exactly to ensure the game keeps up with your ambition. There's an order of operations that seems counterintuitive at first, but makes perfect sense when you stop to think about the logic behind it. Paint first, stack later. Most players do the opposite. They stack the layers, create the complete shape, and then try to apply the colors. And this sequence works, but it's inefficient in a way that only becomes obvious when you start scaling production and realize you're spending extra ink and machines for no reason. The reason is simple. When you paint the 4 quadrants separately before stacking, you are working with smaller and simpler shapes, which means the colorization process is much more direct and controlled. Each quadrant receives exactly the color it needs without interference from other layers, and you use only the amount of ink necessary for that specific piece. When these quadrants reach the stacker, they are already ready. The stacker only needs to do its job of joining the pieces without any extra colorization step afterward. The saving on machines is where this tip really shines in terms of space and construction cost. Painting a shape that is already stacked with multiple layers often requires more complex configurations of mixers and paint applicators to ensure each part of the structure receives the right color without contaminating the others. By doing this before stacking, you eliminate much of this complexity. Each paint station is dedicated to a single quadrant, which means smaller modules that are easier to replicate in blueprints and much easier to diagnose when something goes wrong. When you adopt this sequence as a standard in your factory, you begin to realize that it fits perfectly with other best practices, such as mixing paints near the source and using modular blueprints. Painting before stacking isn't just an isolated optimization. It's part of a larger philosophy of processing each component at the simplest stage possible before combining it with others. The earlier in the production line you finalize each part, the leaner and more efficient the entire operation becomes. And in Shapez 2, efficiency isn't just about speed. It's about building something you can understand, maintain, and expand without losing your mind in the process.